In the quiet, rural stretches of America's heartland, a place where the land meets the sky in endless horizons, there's a man who wakes up each day to tend to his crops and care for his animals. A man whose life had been shaped by hard work, sacrifice, and service to his country. His name is James, and to the world, he's just another farmer, another hard-working soul whose story goes unnoticed. But James isn't just a farmer. He's a man with a past, one that's full of courage and valor, a past that the world may never truly understand. One fateful evening, James found himself caught in a brutal and senseless attack. It was just supposed to be another evening of peace and quiet, but that night, the world he knew would turn upside down. A group of local thugs, emboldened by their racism and their hatred, decided to take matters into their own hands. They saw James for nothing more than the color of his skin, a target to be taken down. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that this farmer was not just any ordinary man. He wasn't someone who would back down from a fight, no matter how fierce. Because behind those rough, calloused hands and the quiet demeanor lay a warrior. A Marine who had served his country with honor. A man who had been awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery and sacrifice on the battlefield. The gang thought they had the upper hand. They were wrong. The attack started like any other. The taunts, the threats, the laughter as they believed they held power over him. But James wasn't just some defenseless target. As the gang approached, they underestimated him, believing their strength in numbers would crush him. What they didn't realize was that they were stepping into the territory of a trained fighter, a man whose loyalty to his country and values had been tested in ways they could never imagine. What happened next would shock them to their core. As the attackers closed in, James' military instincts kicked in. In a flash, his training took over, and what followed was a series of actions that left the gang scrambling, disoriented, and terrified. James was no longer just a farmer. He was a force to be reckoned with. The tables turned quickly, and the very people who thought they had control were now questioning whether they had made the gravest mistake of their lives. But that's not the end of the story. What came after that night would set off a chain of events that none of them could have predicted. The attack may have been over, but the questions, the tensions, the confrontation were just beginning. Why would anyone attack a man like James? What would the aftermath mean for him, his community, and those who sought to do him harm? Was this truly a random act of violence, or was there something much darker at play? James was left with more than just bruises and cuts. He was left with a decision, a choice that would force him to face his past, confront his enemies, and ultimately determine how far he was willing to go to protect not just his farm, but the very values he had fought for. Because in the end, it wasn't just about defending himself. It was about something much bigger. Stay tuned, because what you're about to hear is a story of resilience, courage, and a fight for justice. It's a story about a man who, when faced with hate, fought back in the only way he knew how, by showing them exactly who he was, and what it truly meant to mess with the wrong person. But the question remains, will James be able to hold on to his land, his peace, and his future? Or will the shadows of his past and the dangers of the present come together in a way that he never saw coming? The first blow may have been struck, but the battle was far from over. James had always been a man of few words. Growing up on a small farm in the South, he learned early on that actions spoke louder than anything else. His family didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough to keep them going. His parents taught him the value of hard work, sacrifice, and never giving up, no matter the odds. The lessons came at a young age, but they stuck with him for life. At the age of 18, with nothing but determination in his heart, James enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. He didn't have much of a choice at first. Money was tight and opportunities were scarce. But what he found in the Marines was something deeper. It wasn't just about serving his country. It was about proving to himself that he could rise above, that he could endure the pain, the challenges, and the risks that came with wearing the uniform. Over the years, James rose through the ranks. His service wasn't easy. There were deployments, battles, and moments when he wasn't sure if he was going to make it out alive. But he did, and in doing so, he earned the respect of his peers and superiors alike. He was more than just a Marine. He was a leader, a symbol of what it meant to be unwavering in the face of adversity. It was in the heat of battle, in a place far from home, that James earned the Medal of Honor. The details of that day were something he rarely spoke about. He didn't need to. His actions spoke for themselves. But the price of his bravery was high. His body bore the scars of his service, both visible and hidden, and the emotional toll of war weighed heavily on him. But he never let it show. He came back home and tried to settle into the life he'd always imagined for himself. He bought a small piece of land, a plot of earth that he hoped would bring him some peace. It wasn't much, just a few acres of farmland, but it was his, and it gave him a sense of purpose. Every morning, he would rise before the sun, working the fields with a quiet determination. The work wasn't easy, but it kept him grounded. It gave him something to focus on when the memories of war began to haunt him in the quiet moments. The land became his sanctuary, his place of refuge from the chaos that sometimes threatened to consume him. But that peace was fragile. The town where James had chosen to build his life wasn't exactly known for its progressive attitudes. The residents, mostly white, had been set in their ways for generations. To them, James was an outsider, an intruder who didn't belong. It wasn't so much the color of his skin, although that was certainly a factor. It was his history, his accomplishments, his very presence in a place that had always been theirs. Over the years, there had been whispers, murmurs in the local diner, sidelong glances from the people who passed by his farm. James had become used to it. He didn't need their approval. But there were others who weren't as tolerant, others who believed that someone like James had no right to be living in their town. And that's where the trouble began. The gang that attacked James that night had been lurking in the shadows for a long time. They were known to be troublemakers, a group of young men whose hatred and racism ran deep. They had never liked the idea of a black man farming in their town, let alone a man who had served in the military, earning a medal that they could never hope to achieve. To them, James was a symbol of everything they despised. He represented the things they feared, the progress, the change, and the challenge to their narrow worldview. They saw his success as a direct threat to their existence. The attack wasn't random. It was the culmination of months, even years, of simmering resentment. The group had been watching James from afar, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when that moment came, they didn't hesitate. They thought it would be easy. They thought they could intimidate him, break him, show him that he didn't belong. But they underestimated him. When they first approached James, they were cocky, confident that he would cower before them. They were used to getting their way, used to people being afraid of them. They thought that the sight of their numbers would make him back down, make him retreat into his home and hide. But James didn't flinch. He didn't run. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on theirs, as if daring them to take the first step. The leader of the gang, a man named Kyle, was the first to speak. "What's a guy like you doing in a place like this?" He sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. James didn't answer. He didn't need to. The words didn't matter. They were meaningless. The only thing that mattered was what came next. And what came next was the sound of a fist hitting a jaw. James moved faster than they could react. He was a Marine, and his body had been trained to respond to threats without hesitation. Kyle, the leader, stumbled backward, his face already bruising from the impact. The others were shocked, momentarily frozen in place. They hadn't expected him to fight back. But James wasn't done. He knew that in a situation like this, there was no room for mercy. He had to protect himself, protect his land, and protect the life he had built. One by one, the gang members lunged at him, but they were no match for his skill, his precision. He took them down with a series of swift, calculated movements, each blow landing with devastating effect. By the time it was over, the gang was in disarray, nursing their wounds and questioning whether they had made a grave mistake. But even as they limped away, battered and bruised, James knew that this wouldn't be the end of it. They would be back, they would regroup, and they would try again. And that's when the real trouble began. The town had already been divided over James's presence. Some of the residents quietly respected him, while others openly despised him. But after the attack, everything changed. The whispers turned into open hostility. People began to take sides, and what had once been a quiet farm town became a battleground. James was left to wonder what his future held. Would he be able to stay in his home, the place he had fought for in more ways than one, or would the forces of hatred and fear drive him out? He knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something bigger, something that went beyond the small-town borders. He had fought for his country, and he had earned his place in history. But now he was fighting for his right to live in peace. The question was, would the town give him that peace? Or would they continue to push him, test him, until he was forced to leave everything behind? The gang had left, but their influence was still there, lingering like a storm on the horizon. James could feel it, the weight of the tension pressing down on him. The night may have ended, but the battle was far from over. And he had no idea just how far it would go before it reached its conclusion. The days following the attack felt like a haze to James. The pain in his body, the bruises still fresh and purple, were a constant reminder of what had happened. But the emotional scars, the ones that dug deep and refused to heal, were far more lasting. He hadn't just been physically assaulted. His sense of safety, his right to exist in this small town without fear, had been shattered. Every time he stepped outside, he felt the eyes of the community upon him, the whispers just beyond earshot, waiting to judge him. It wasn't just the gang anymore. It was everyone. Kyle and his crew had retreated, licking their wounds and no doubt plotting their next move. But their attack had ignited something larger. The town, divided on so many fronts already, began to fracture even more. James hadn't realized just how deep the resentment went, how much of it had been bubbling under the surface, waiting for a spark. And now the fire had started. There were those who sympathized with him, those who admired his strength, his resilience, and the way he'd fought back. These people were few, but they mattered. Among them was Ruth, the elderly widow who lived 2 doors down from him. She had never spoken out loud about the prejudices of the town, but James knew. She'd seen it, heard it, and quietly endured it for years. Ruth had grown up in a different era, and while she was no radical, she respected the man who stood on his own 2 feet, no matter his skin color. She was one of the few who didn't see James as an outsider, but as someone worthy of respect. "You did what you had to do, James," Ruth told him one afternoon, her voice soft but steady as they sat on her porch. "But they won't stop. That gang, and the people behind them, they won't let it go." James sighed deeply, looking out over his fields, the dirt and the crops now a symbol of both his independence and the conflicts swirling around him. He hadn't asked for any of this. All he'd wanted was peace. But peace seemed to be a luxury he could no longer afford. He had been trained for combat, for warfare. But this wasn't the battlefield. This was his home, his sanctuary. He didn't want to fight, but it seemed that's what life had decided for him. Ruth's voice broke through his thoughts. "You're not alone, James. There's people who will stand by you." But Ruth's words were bittersweet. There was a quiet tension in her eyes, a sadness that spoke of a time when her own courage had been tested, and she had been forced to watch as the world around her changed in ways she couldn't control. James knew that she, too, was afraid of what might happen if things escalated further. The gang would return, of that much he was certain. But what if others followed? What if the town itself turned against him? While James wrestled with his thoughts, the gang had been making their own moves, regrouping in the dark corners of town. Kyle, their leader, was a man who'd never been particularly bright, but he was fueled by something far more dangerous than intelligence, hatred. He had his crew, a small but determined group of like-minded individuals who saw James as a threat, not just to their town, but to their sense of superiority. The attack had failed, but that only made them more determined. They weren't about to back down, not when there was still so much more to prove. Kyle's anger had been building for years, long before he'd ever laid eyes on James. He hated the idea of anyone questioning his authority, especially someone who was different. When he first saw James, the way he carried himself, so sure, so calm, it triggered something deep inside him. Kyle had been raised in a world where power came from fear, and James, this black man, this Marine, this Medal of Honor recipient, was a reminder of how small his world really was. The attack had been meant to assert dominance, to put James in his place, but it had backfired spectacularly. Now, Kyle had no choice but to escalate. He was smart enough to know that brute force alone wouldn't work, so he began to work on a different strategy. He began talking to the other members of the town, those who might share his views, even if they weren't as outwardly violent. The older generation, the ones who had always been skeptical of change, began to whisper louder. They spoke of the good old days, when things were simpler, when people knew their place. And James didn't know his place. He was an outsider who had come into their world, uninvited, and now it was up to them to restore order. In town, the tension was palpable. James could feel it whenever he went into town for supplies, or simply to check in with the few people who still treated him like a person, not a symbol. The stares, the hushed conversations that would die down when he walked into a room, they were all subtle, but they were there. It didn't take much to see the writing on the wall. There were those who believed James should be pushed out, forced to leave. They couldn't abide the thought of a man who had fought for his country being so out of place in their town. One evening, as James was working late on his farm, trying to focus on anything other than the storm brewing in his life, there was a knock at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone. He'd opened the door, and there stood Nathaniel, a young man who worked at the local hardware store. Nathaniel was quiet, often keeping to himself, but James had always treated him with kindness. Nathaniel was a soft-spoken man, and James had never heard him speak out against the prevailing sentiment in the town. But tonight there was something different in his eyes. "I've got something for you," Nathaniel said, his voice low, almost hesitant. He handed James a piece of paper. James took it, unfolded it, and scanned the contents. It was a letter, unsigned, but it didn't need a name to be clear in its meaning. The letter was a warning. It told James that he wasn't welcome. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about sending a message. The people who didn't like him were coming together, organizing behind closed doors, and soon they would take action. The message was simple: leave or face the consequences. James' eyes narrowed as he read the letter, his fingers clenching around the paper. He knew exactly what this meant. The gang hadn't just attacked him for fun. They were sending a message to everyone in the town who might be sympathetic to him. They wanted him gone, and they would do whatever it took to make that happen. The letter was a direct threat. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened in history, and it wouldn't be the last. But for James, it was personal. This wasn't some distant injustice. This was happening to him, in his town, and he had no idea how far it would go. Nathaniel stood there, shifting uncomfortably. "I don't know what to tell you, James, but you've got to be careful. People are watching." James nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the words sink in. He thanked Nathaniel, but the young man didn't seem reassured. As he walked away, James could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that was now creeping into his own heart. What was he supposed to do now? He couldn't run. He couldn't just leave everything behind. The farm, his life, it was all he had. But the danger was real, and it was growing by the day. Would the town ever accept him, or had he already lost the battle before it even truly began? And if the fight came to his doorstep once more, would he be able to protect everything he had worked so hard for? The battle lines were being drawn, but James didn't know which side of them he stood on anymore. The conflict wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger, about what this country stood for, about who had the right to call a place home, and about the lengths people would go to in order to preserve their vision of what the world should look like. And James, he was caught in the middle, forced to fight a battle he never asked for. But no matter what happened, he would fight. Because at the end of the day, this was his land, his home, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him, not without a fight. The days that followed the letter felt like they were stretching out forever. Every morning, James would wake up, unsure if he would be walking into a trap or if that day would be just like any other. He had always prided himself on being someone who could adapt, someone who could take whatever life threw at him and keep going. But this was different. The threat wasn't some distant battlefront or enemy he couldn't see. This was real, this was personal, and it was closing in on him faster than he could prepare. The town, once a quiet place where everyone minded their own business, had become a pressure cooker. James could feel the tension building, the weight of all the eyes on him every time he went into town for supplies, or even just to talk to the few people who hadn't turned their backs on him. The whispers had become louder, more hostile. There were fewer and fewer friendly faces in the crowd, and it seemed like everyone had chosen a side. Most people had decided they didn't want anything to do with him. They didn't want to stand up for what was right. They were either too afraid or too comfortable in their old ways to risk standing with a man like James. But there were still a few. Ruth, of course, had been the most vocal in her support. She'd been talking to people, trying to rally those who still believed in fairness and decency. But she was old, and though her heart was as strong as it ever was, there was a sense of wariness about her now. She knew what was coming, and she was afraid that even her strength might not be enough to keep the darkness at bay. One evening, as James worked late into the night, putting up fences and checking on the livestock, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't anything specific, just a gut feeling. The air around him felt thick, as though the world had momentarily held its breath. He stopped, standing still for a moment, listening. There was nothing at first, just the usual sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But then he heard something else. A car, distant but unmistakable. The low rumble of an engine that didn't belong in the quiet of the evening. James' heart started to beat faster. He had no idea who it was, but the hair on his neck told him everything he needed to know. Slowly, he moved toward the edge of his property, just enough to get a glimpse of the road. The headlights were far off, but as they grew closer, he saw the shape of the vehicle. A pickup truck, one of the ones that had been following him around town, one of Kyle's crew. His instincts screamed at him to move, to get inside and lock the door, but something stopped him. He had no intention of running, not again. The truck stopped at the edge of his property, the engine cutting off abruptly, leaving an eerie silence behind it. For a moment, nothing moved. Then he saw them, figures emerging from the truck, walking slowly toward his farmhouse. It was Kyle and a couple of his boys, looking almost too comfortable as they made their way across his land. James didn't wait for them to get any closer. He took a deep breath, grounded himself, and moved toward the barn. He knew there wasn't much he could do if they were planning on taking things to the next level, but he wouldn't go down without a fight. He grabbed a crowbar from the workbench, his fingers wrapping tightly around the cold metal, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it would have to do. He crept toward the front of the barn, his heart pounding in his chest. From the corner of his eye, he saw Kyle's group getting closer, each of them carrying a heavy air of arrogance. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they could break him, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. As they reached the steps leading up to his porch, James stepped out from behind the barn, his voice low and steady. "You better turn around and leave, now," he said, his grip tight on the crowbar. Kyle stopped in his tracks, a wicked grin spreading across his face as he recognized the man who had already humbled him once. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" he sneered. "You think you're special because of that stupid medal?" James didn't answer. He didn't need to. Kyle's words were nothing but empty noise, and James wasn't about to let them distract him. He could feel his pulse quicken, the tension in his body coiling tighter. "What, you're gonna fight us all by yourself?" Kyle taunted, looking over at his friends. They chuckled under their breath, clearly thinking they had the upper hand. "You don't get it, do you?" James said, his voice growing firmer. "You've been messing with the wrong man." Kyle's grin faltered, but only for a moment. He motioned to the others, and they began to circle around James. It was clear now, they weren't just here to scare him. They were here to finish what they'd started. The quiet that had settled over the farm was now thick with the looming sense of something terrible about to happen. James stood his ground. He wasn't about to let them take everything he had built. They could try to break him, but they would never defeat him. He would never let them. Before anyone could make a move, there was a sudden noise behind him. A sharp crack, like the sound of a twig snapping. James whipped around, heart pounding. There, just behind the barn, he saw a shadow moving. It was Ruth. She had been watching from the windows of her house, and she hadn't stayed quiet. She had called the one person who might help, Sheriff Dalton, a man who had lived in the town for years, and unlike many, had always kept his moral compass pointed in the right direction. But even with the sheriff on the way, James knew this could go either way. Ruth's voice was quiet but strong. "They don't know who they're messing with, James," she called out. "They'll see soon enough." The men hesitated, but Kyle wasn't the kind of man who backed down. "You think your old friend is gonna save you?" He spat, looking towards the road, where the sirens of a police car could just be heard faintly in the distance. It was now or never. James knew this wasn't just about him. It was about standing up to a system that had let this kind of hatred go unchecked for far too long. It was about proving that the quiet farmer, the veteran who had given everything for his country, wouldn't be silenced or pushed out. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for something much bigger than that. He was fighting for the right to exist, for the future of the people who still believed in what was right. Kyle saw the sheriff's car coming down the road, the flashing lights cutting through the darkness. His eyes flicked to the other men, and they seemed to hesitate, unsure of what to do next. This was the moment, the tipping point. James was ready for whatever was coming, but the question was, would the sheriff be enough to turn the tide, or was this going to escalate into something far worse than he had imagined? As the lights grew brighter and the sirens grew louder, James could feel the weight of everything pressing in on him. The pieces were in motion. The stakes had never been higher, and the next few minutes would decide everything. Would he finally be able to make them see the truth, or was this the beginning of the end? The air was thick with tension, and everything seemed to hang in the balance. But James knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going down without a fight. Not now, not ever. As the sheriff's car approached, the tension in the air thickened. The flashing lights reflected off the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped moving. Just this frozen, suspended reality where the only sound was the pounding of James' heart. He couldn't afford to blink. Not now. The stakes were higher than ever, and the situation was slipping into something far darker than he could have imagined. Kyle saw the sheriff's car getting closer and made a quick, almost imperceptible gesture to the others. His men, who had been circling James like wolves, now stood at attention, their expressions hardening. James had thought they were here to intimidate him, to finish what they started with the beating. But now he could sense something deeper, something more sinister in their movements. There was a purpose to this. They weren't just looking for a fight. They were playing a game, and James was the pawn. For a split second, it felt like they might back down, retreat into the darkness, and let the sheriff's presence settle the issue. But then, just as the sheriff's car rolled up to the edge of the farm, a figure emerged from the shadows near the back of the truck. A man James hadn't seen before, but someone who clearly wasn't part of Kyle's usual crew. This new figure was tall, broad-shouldered, and his presence seemed to alter the dynamics of the standoff in an instant. The man walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the scene, assessing it like a predator determining its next move. He was calm, too calm for someone who had just arrived in the middle of an escalating conflict. He wasn't fazed by the sirens or the tension between the men. It was as if he was waiting for something James wasn't ready for. "Who the hell are you?" Kyle's voice was sharp, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty in it now. James could see that Kyle didn't like this new player. He didn't like being out of control. The man's lips curled into a slow smile, almost as if he had expected Kyle's reaction. "Just someone who knows how to finish what you started," he said, his voice low, almost too smooth. It was a voice that didn't belong in this town, a voice that carried the weight of someone who had seen things James couldn't even begin to imagine. James felt a chill crawl up his spine. This man wasn't just another thug. He was different, and he wasn't here to help him. He was here to make things worse. Before anyone could react, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a small device, something that gleamed in the flashing lights of the sheriff's car. James' eyes widened as he recognized it. It was a detonator. His heart skipped a beat. The man's grin widened, and in that instant, the gravity of the situation hit James like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a fight over land or pride anymore. This was a power play, a calculated move that went beyond any personal grudge or gang war. This was a message, a threat to everyone in the town. If the gang and their newfound ally couldn't intimidate James into submission, they would burn it all to the ground. "Not so fast," the man said, his voice now echoing with authority. "If you think you can just bring the sheriff in and make things peaceful, you're mistaken. You're about to learn just how far people will go when they're backed into a corner." He turned his eyes toward Kyle, as if making sure the leader understood. "The town's been warned. We don't take kindly to anyone who doesn't know their place." For a brief moment, it was as though the world had paused. The sheriff's car pulled up just a few yards away, its lights flashing brightly. The sirens cut through the night air like a scream, but in the tense silence that followed, it was as if everyone was waiting for something to break. James felt his pulse race as the implications of what was happening settled into his mind. This was bigger than a gang attack. This was about control, about sending a message that would echo far beyond the small farm. James wasn't just a victim of prejudice and hate anymore. He had become the focal point of a larger game, a game that could change everything. He wasn't just fighting for his land. He was fighting for the future of this town, for the right to stand without fear. But the game had just changed, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what came next. The sheriff's deputy stepped out of the vehicle, his hand hovering near his holster. James could see the uncertainty in the sheriff's eyes. This wasn't something the law could easily handle. There was something dangerous brewing here, something beyond a simple case of assault or intimidation. Kyle, clearly seeing the confusion in the sheriff's demeanor, took a step forward, his own voice filled with venom. "You really think you can just show up here and stop us?" he sneered. "This is bigger than you, bigger than your badge." The new man, the one with the detonator, didn't flinch. He merely stood there, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he held the device like a weight of doom in his hand. "Do you really want to find out what happens when you try to stop the people who run this town?" the man asked, his voice laced with malice. "I can guarantee it won't be pretty." The sheriff hesitated, his hand still resting near his gun, but the situation was quickly spiraling out of his control. James could see the fear in his eyes. This was more than a simple brawl. Whoever this man was, whatever organization or group he represented, they had more power, more reach than the sheriff could handle. The balance of power had shifted, and James was no longer just trying to defend his farm. He was trying to save the town from a force far greater than anything he had imagined. As the tension reached its breaking point, James took a deep breath. This wasn't how he imagined it would go. But then again, nothing in his life had ever gone the way he planned. The fight that had started with a simple act of violence was now a ticking time bomb. He had to act. There was no turning back. Before anyone could make another move, there was another sound. This time, not from the men standing in front of him, but from somewhere beyond the tree line. The unmistakable sound of more vehicles approaching. This wasn't just a fight between a gang and a farmer anymore. This was becoming a standoff between two forces, one that wanted to intimidate and one that was willing to destroy everything to gain control. James turned toward the sound, his mind racing. Were reinforcements coming for Kyle? Or was this the cavalry he had hoped would show up? He had no time to think. The pieces were in motion, and they were all converging at once. The danger had escalated beyond anything he could have prepared for. The stakes were higher now. The small-town fight had become a battle for something much bigger: control, power, and survival. And James was at the center of it, with nowhere to hide and no clear way out. The man with the detonator gave a cold, calculating smile. This was just the beginning. The tension in the air was thick, heavy, and suffocating. James stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, his fingers tight around the crowbar, his mind racing for a way out of this nightmare. The man with the detonator grinned, his confidence so assured it made James' stomach turn. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The sheriff stood frozen by his car, his eyes darting between James, the newcomers, and the oncoming vehicles, unsure of what to do, caught in a situation he hadn't prepared for. The new figures emerging from the trees weren't the cavalry James had hoped for. In fact, they were another group, another faction. More men, more players, all with a dangerous, unsettling air about them. It was clear that this was bigger than anyone had imagined. What started as a personal conflict had spiraled into something far more sinister. James could see it now. Kyle and his crew weren't the only ones trying to seize control of the town. There was a deeper, darker force at work here, and James was right in the middle of it. But then, just as the situation reached a boiling point, something unexpected happened. The sheriff, who had been standing still in the face of the growing threat, made a move. He reached down to his radio, calling in backup, but it wasn't the usual call for reinforcements. It was a special code, a signal James recognized from his time in the service. The sheriff wasn't just asking for more officers, he was calling in something far more significant. The moment the radio crackled to life, the new men's expressions changed. The tall man with the detonator, who had seemed so confident, now looked momentarily thrown off, his grin faltering. "What's this?" he muttered, his eyes narrowing. James didn't wait for a response. He felt something shift inside him, an overwhelming surge of clarity. This was it. The time for waiting was over. He had no more room for fear, no more time for hesitation. Whatever was coming, whatever had just been set in motion, he had to act now. He took a deep breath, tightening his grip on the crowbar. In one swift motion, he charged toward the man with the detonator, his body moving with the speed and precision he had honed during his years of service. The shock on the man's face was evident as James reached him in a flash, knocking the detonator from his hand with a well-aimed strike. The device clattered to the ground, harmless now, its threat diffused in an instant. But the fight wasn't over. The other men reacted immediately, pulling out weapons, ready to retaliate. The sheriff's deputies, now aware of the danger and the real scale of what was happening, drew their own guns, the tension snapping like a taut wire. But before any shots were fired, the sound of multiple sirens, louder and more urgent than ever before, filled the air. More police cars appeared, blocking the road from all directions, effectively trapping the attackers. James stood tall, still gripping the crowbar, his pulse racing, but his resolve unwavering. This was his moment. This was the moment everything changed. He wasn't just fighting for his farm anymore. He was fighting for the future, for his country, for every person who had ever been bullied or oppressed. And it was no longer just about him. It was about proving that people could rise above fear, rise above hatred, and stand together in the face of evil. The man with the detonator, now unarmed and surrounded, turned toward Kyle, his face twisted in disbelief. "You said we had control," he hissed. Kyle's usual bravado had vanished. He looked around, seeing his men being overpowered, their weapons confiscated. The tension between them all was palpable, but it was clear that the tables had turned. James wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The sheriff's team had arrived, and they weren't here to negotiate. They were here to restore order. But then came the real twist. Just as the situation seemed under control, just as James allowed himself to believe that victory was within his reach, another vehicle rolled up. This one wasn't a police car. It wasn't a gang member either. It was a sleek, black SUV with tinted windows. It stopped just beyond the chaos, And for a moment, everything froze. A man stepped out of the vehicle. He wasn't just any man. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his demeanor calm, almost too calm for a situation like this. He scanned the scene with cold, calculating eyes, his gaze briefly meeting James. "You've done well, James," the man said, his voice smooth, but carrying an undeniable authority. "But this isn't over." The words hit James like a slap in the face. This man wasn't part of Kyle's crew, wasn't just some random player. He was someone far more dangerous. The air seemed to shift again, thickening with tension. This man, whoever he was, had just made everything more complicated. James took a step back, his mind racing. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, trying to make sense of it all. The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was the smile of someone who held all the cards. "I'm the one who's been pulling the strings," he said, his voice cold and measured. "The one who set this whole thing in motion." James' eyes widened, the weight of the realization settling over him. The gang, the attack, the threats, it had all been part of something bigger than he could have ever imagined. This wasn't just a fight between two factions. This was a war, a calculated, strategic attempt to force change, and James had been the perfect pawn. "You're a fool if you think this is over," the man continued, stepping closer. "This isn't just about land or power. This is about resetting the balance. And now that you've gotten involved, you're part of it." James felt his stomach drop. He hadn't just been fighting for his life. He had been playing into a much larger scheme, a game he didn't even fully understand yet. But there was no turning back now. The stakes had just gotten higher. The line between friend and foe had blurred. Before James could react, the man turned to Kyle and his men, who were now being arrested by the sheriff's deputies. "This will all be dealt with in time," the man said, his tone final. "But you, James, you've made things interesting. And that's what I need. Interesting." James could feel the weight of the moment, the realization of how much more was at play, closing in around him. He thought he had won. But in reality, this was only the beginning. The game had just shifted again, and James was right in the center of it. As the man turned and climbed back into the SUV, his words echoed in James's mind. "We'll be in touch," he called out, the door slamming shut behind him. The sheriff stood there, his mouth agape. What the hell just happened? He muttered under his breath, clearly stunned by the turn of events. James didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could do was watch as the SUV disappeared into the distance, knowing that whatever came next, it was far from over. This was just the beginning. As the SUV disappeared into the distance, the weight of what had just unfolded began to settle over James like a thick fog. The sheriff stood nearby, still processing what had happened, his hands shaking slightly as he glanced at the now cuffed gang members being loaded into the police cars. But his focus kept drifting back to James, his gaze filled with confusion and disbelief. The sheriff had never anticipated anything like this, not in his wildest dreams. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension that had once filled the air seemed to dissipate, but it was replaced with a different kind of unease, a deep, unanswered question lingering in the space between them all. James wiped the sweat from his forehead, his eyes still locked on the spot where the SUV had vanished. There was no way to make sense of it all. The man in the suit, the orchestrator behind the chaos, he had revealed nothing about his intentions. Just cryptic words, a promise of more to come, and a chilling reminder that James had been a part of something much bigger than he had ever realized. The sheriff finally cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "What the hell just happened, James? Who were those people?" James shook his head slowly, still trying to digest the magnitude of the situation. He had thought that standing up to the gang, defending his farm, was the hardest thing he'd ever done. But now, after the arrival of the man in the SUV, it felt like nothing had been as simple as he once believed. The truth was, he didn't have all the answers. He didn't know who these people were or what their endgame was, but he knew one thing for sure: it wasn't over. He was no longer just fighting for his land. He was now part of something far larger, something much darker, and he had no choice but to face it head-on. "I don't know," James muttered, his voice low. "But we're not done here, not by a long shot." The sheriff nodded, his expression hardening. "I'll get my team to dig into this. You're right, this isn't just some random gang. Whoever they are, they've got resources, and they're pulling strings. We need to find out who's behind this." James didn't respond. He didn't have the energy to say much more. All he could do was watch as the last of the gang members were taken away in handcuffs, their eyes filled with a mix of anger and fear. Kyle, the leader, was among them, his defiant expression now replaced with one of resignation. He had lost. But James knew that wasn't the end for Kyle. People like him didn't just give up that easily. They would fight back. As the sheriff walked off to make arrangements with his team, James stood alone, staring out at his farm. The land that had been the site of so much pain and struggle now seemed oddly peaceful, the tension of the night slowly ebbing away. But it wasn't a peaceful peace. It was the calm before the storm. There was no escaping it. He had made his stand, and while he'd won this battle, the war was far from over. The next few days passed in a blur of interviews, police reports, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. The sheriff's department worked tirelessly, investigating every lead, trying to piece together the story behind the mysterious man in the SUV. But for all their efforts, there was no clear trail to follow. It was as if the man had appeared out of nowhere, as if he were a ghost with no past, no identity. Whoever he was, he had made sure to cover his tracks. James didn't have the luxury of waiting for answers. He had his own problems to deal with. The farm needed his attention, and the repairs from the earlier attack were still ongoing. But the feeling of being watched, of being part of something larger than himself, never left him. It lingered, haunting him in the quiet moments when he was alone. One evening, as James was working late, trying to catch up on the damage from the attack, a familiar figure appeared at the gate. It was the sheriff again, his expression grim. "Got something for you, James," he said, holding up a manila envelope. "I didn't want to tell you this over the phone. Thought you'd want to see it for yourself." James took the envelope, his curiosity piqued. He ripped it open, unfolding the contents. Inside was a series of photos, grainy but unmistakable. They were of the man in the suit, the one who had driven the SUV. There was no doubt in James's mind. The photos were recent, taken from a distance, but they were clear enough to show that the man had been watching him for some time. "I had my team run a background check," the sheriff continued. "This guy is a ghost. No real name, no known address. But these pictures tell a different story. He's been in the area longer than we thought, and it looks like he's been keeping tabs on you, James." James stared at the photos, his stomach churning. The man wasn't just a random player. He was someone who had been planning this for a long time. Someone who had a purpose, and James had unknowingly walked right into it. The sheriff paused, looking at James with a mix of concern and determination. "This isn't over, and I need your help, James. If you're willing to do your part, we can take this guy down." James looked at the sheriff, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what the sheriff had in mind, but one thing was clear. He couldn't walk away from this. The man in the suit, whoever he was, had drawn him into a larger game, and he wasn't going to back down now. "Tell me what I need to do," James said, his voice steady. The sheriff nodded, a small but determined smile crossing his face. "We'll need you to cooperate, James. We need to set a trap. If he's been watching you, then he's going to keep an eye on your farm. We can use that." James's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what this trap would look like or how it would play out, but he knew one thing: it was a risk. But it was a risk he was willing to take. He had no choice. The days that followed were filled with preparations. James went back to work on the farm, acting as if everything was normal, but all the while, he knew something was coming. The sheriff's team set up surveillance, quietly watching from the shadows, waiting for the man in the suit to make his move. And then, on a quiet afternoon, it happened. The man in the suit reappeared, just as the sheriff had predicted. He showed up at the farm, just like he had been doing all along, watching from a distance, making sure James didn't catch on. But this time, the sheriff's team was ready. They moved in quickly, surrounding the area, cutting off any possible escape routes. The man in the suit didn't seem surprised. In fact, he looked almost resigned, as if he had known this day was coming. But there was no escape for him now. The sheriff's team had him cornered. As the man was taken into custody, James watched from a distance, a sense of grim satisfaction settling in. The mystery was over, or at least, the first chapter of it was. The man was finally going to face justice. Later that evening, James stood in his barn, looking out over the land he had fought so hard to protect. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace. The farm was safe, the danger had passed, and he had won. But deep down, James knew there would always be more challenges ahead. The world was changing, and he would have to keep adapting, keep fighting for what he believed in. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or oppressed. He had proven that standing up for what's right, no matter the odds, could make a difference. As he walked back to his house, he could feel the weight of everything he had endured lifting off his shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but for now, James was finally free. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better.